Or we can do what he describes as enhancing figuration, and Goethe and Steiner are the exemplars of that. And that is basically to sort of progressively um, uh, see through the appearances even more deeply to then these kind of spiritual beings. So anyway, that's a long summary. I'll stop with that. We can pick it up from there.
Hmm. So the phenomena that we see with our physical senses become not mere material surfaces, but signs and symbols that can be read. There's a meaning there to be uncovered, but we need to restore this kind of participation. Um, and so, yeah, Daniel, what do you think about this? The empowerment that Barfield is attributing, the power, I should say, that he's attributing to language and poetry. Do you think that this is the right medium to turn to in order to transform consciousness? Poetry? I mean, what about film? What about other art forms? I mean, are those themselves forms of poetry? Or because I know you like to you're quite an accomplished poet, I would say. I've listened to some of your work on YouTube. So yeah, what do you think about Barfield's relationship to poetry and its role?
You're gonna make me blush, Matt. My goodness. Maybe we'll freeze when I'm blushing, and then you'll have a permanent image. So we will see. No, that's tremendous. So I think there is very good reason. So there's a few things. One of the things that Owen Barfield, I think it's just actually true. Like in the history of the English words, like literature and words uniquely give you an insight into the consciousness of a people. I think Gadamer in Truth and Method talks about art as being the best way to get at history because, and even someone like Hayden, the great historian Hayden White, talked about one of the mistakes is we read history as facts versus literature, and as a result, we can't enter into history. And so there's something very important about literature because it has to be married to the kind of way the people see the world when they write the literature. It's just impossible to do otherwise. There are various theories too. Like there are some people, I don't remember who came up with this theory, on the idea that you see the birth of a certain individualized subjectivity between the Iliad and the Odyssey. You look at Memensis by Auerbach, where you compare Abraham with, Homer. And Homer, every detail is expressed orally, but then when it's written down, it's much scantier because it's much more psychological. I mean, you could also bring in, there's obviously Marshall McLuhan with the medium in this, but like William Ong, for example, on the idea that the movement from oral to the printing transformed how consciousness experienced the world. Now, there's a question there. Is it the information technology or is the use of language that the information technology puts forth that changes consciousness, right? Well, like if Owen Barfield is correct about language, then language is actually the primary medium of the transformation of the mode of consciousness, and the information technologies are simply, I don't want to say accidental, they're the medium condition that I'll talk about instead of the material or the ideal condition that invites a new way of dialogue that transforms the consciousness that is toward the world. And if Dietrich McCloskey is right that a change in how people spoke in the Dutch Empire created an explosion of wealth, if Jonathan Rauch is correct in Kindly Inquisitor that how people speak transforms information, then yes, language is absolutely at the center of it. And then anecdotally, in my experience, people who read literature not as surgeons looking for, the secret intention of the author, but to let the idiot of Dostoevsky wash over them, or the poetry of Wallace Stevens, they talk different. They think different. They enjoy things. They have a different value set. Now that's completely anecdotal. But then when we look at it, say Randall Collins looking at network effects, they take the Inklings. These guys are all talking about literature and writing and poetry and all this different stuff. And then they're also philosophical and theological. I think when you look at history, and I don't think it's just literary people talking with literary people. I think when you look at the use of language in whether it be a William Ong, a Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, when you look at an Alfred Korbowski on the very structure of language, if it entails, his big thing is rooting out isness from language. And he basically wants to restructure the structures of thinking and language without isness, which identification I would associate with the idolatry that Mr. Barfield is putting forth. So both of them, so the way people talk absolutely changes how they're told the world. And the reason why this is then also extremely important is because on the question of where does value come from, you know, we were talking about the solo residue in the last conversation, like axiology. I know with the physics of world spirit, this idea with Whitehead that value, creativity is kind of central. Language might be precisely the kind of training zone of those capacities of subjectivity that have very big practical impacts on the world. And so I think the stakes are very high, and Owen Barfield and Steiner, in this very close analysis of the history of language, which then follows into some of these literary critics, make an incredibly strong case that language should be central in our thinking, because language. And I was also just going to comment quickly, like on this idea, Owen Barfield also on this idea of how reality is toward us, if it's relational. I can ask, you know, the fact that I experienced this bookcase as brown, how is that for consciousness? Like it's an invitation to think about myself in relationship to the bookcase. Phenomenon become, the percepts invite you for that. Well, language does the same, because you're actively choosing what kind of experiences for the other you're putting in the world, how things are framed and shaped towards you. And I think that, like, the capacity of people to speak to one another, well, the last thing I'll say on this, what is most of society, if you like, when you think about like dating, what's like all of dating kind of about a lot of times? Conversation, going to dinner and talking. What do you do at it mostly? You have a meal and you talk. Like, it's actually incredible how much of social infrastructure is designed around the speech act. Like, it's actually incredible. Now, yeah, you can go to movies too, but, you know, most people are like, you really should have dinner before that and speak. And what do they always say? Conversation and relationship is a big deal. Communication is a big deal. Like, you see glimmers, in a sense, glimmers and traces here and there in all these different areas of some kind of increasing realization that the speech act is really important. You can then even get into psychoanalysis on like a Lacan, or for all these different people talking about the speech act being important. And a society that is not able to engage in a more literary speech act, that is not really able to kind of own these things, is going to have a different subjectivity from other people. And that will have, and then this would be my closing point, this has practical impacts. This is not merely decorations. This is how people are toward one another in the society, and will also impact the kind of values that are practiced and interacted in. And if we want to talk about new economics, new markets, new politics, then this is going to be a central question to the kind of training of that kind of subjectivity. So I'm convinced of it. And again, I just, from anecdotal evidence, I think about like people who do poetry. I had a lot of interaction with like spoken word artists through Bernard Hankins or the hip hop cipher. We work with young kids at Unoyas and different things, and how much that change of relationship to language and the kind of creativity and the hope and meaning that actually would come out of that change relationship to meaning was incredibly obvious, incredibly obvious. And so I think Owen Barfield's work just helps provide scaffolding and justification for some of those anecdotal experiences as well. But let me pass it on.
Yeah, beautiful. You know, I'm just speaking of McLuhan and Ong and the importance of and attending to the medium. You know, here we are on Zoom. We're not at the Eagle and the Child in Oxford, where the Inklings used to drink beer, and they called it the Bird and the Baby affectionately. Been to that pub. It's not what it used to be, apparently. But this conversation, mediated by this technology, puts us in a quite unique situation. You're in Virginia, Ashton's in San Francisco, I'm here in Oakland. Totally different context in terms of where our bodies are. And we're recording this, and others will listen to it. We have no idea who they are. It's a rather unique situation that affords some things and inhibits other things, right? But I like the expansive way you're talking about language here, because language, as I hear you speaking to it, Daniel, becomes sort of like a meta medium. I mean, all of these mediums are language in some sense, and we exist within that. We inhabit language. And the importance of recognizing how language is not just I mean, it can become cheap talk, it can become gossip, it can become overly abstract. And, just to bring in the incarnational side of this, which is quite literally crucial for Barfield in the evolution of consciousness, the logos is made flesh, right? And so we live and die by the word. The ways that we talk to one another, we create one another, and we create the world we share together in the ways that we engage with our poetic power. And so what a responsibility. Jeez. Yeah, I don't know that I have another question for you, Ashton, but in anything that's been said thus far, I mean, or ideas occurring to you that you'd like to throw into the mix?
Well, yeah, I think a couple things. One way Barfield talks about the evolution of consciousness with respect to language in particular, like the role of language, apart from language in ancient languages and etymology being this source of insight into the past, is that he says that language was the kind of tool through which we forged our subjectivity, and that it precipitated out of this primordial experience, immediate experience of meaning in the world, and that the world itself is language-like, and that the process of internalizing the word-like world through memory is what gradually leads to language, and then language itself facilitates a kind of emancipation from just the total unity with the life of nature, but also there's this potential to be locked in the virtual enclosure, that language that is no longer reflective of an inner continuity between the human soul and the soul of the world can lead to.
Yeah, I think a lot about the sin of literalness or literalism, and how important it is to remain in a poetic relationship to language, such that we both don't lose sight of what you're saying as sort of aesthetic realism, that there's real value there to be conveyed, and we can do better or worse at that in given different situations with our choice of words. But we also avoid just a sort of nominalistic relativism, where it's like the meaning of words is just convention, and there's nothing real there that corresponds to the meaning of our language. We're kind of just making it up in our little social circles, and it's kind of a collective solipsism, these collective representations that we're imprisoned in. Poetry does allow us to break through to the real. So rather than it, just being fantasy, it's imagination, poetic imagination as an organ of perception, right? And even speech, Barfield, drawing on Steiner, would think of speech as an organ of perception. And actually Steiner has this whole interesting esoteric physiology that I won't pretend to be able to rehearse in any precision here, but basically the mouth and the ears, for Steiner, the larynx and our organs of hearing are actually one organ that allows us to perceive speech, right? Because we don't just talk, we have to hear too for this to work. There's a listening and there's an active and a passive side to it. But also, like, perception, I think one of the invitations here from Barfield is to recognize that perception is already symbolic, and language is just a further development of the meaning evident in our perception of nature, right? And so we're not making up the meaning with language, with our words. The fact that we can have words and speech is only possible because our embodied perceptual encounter with the aesthetic display of the cosmos is already meaningful, right? And the issue is we've moved from that original participation where the direction was from world to human, in terms of the meaning. And now we're in a position where, because of our freedom, that vector has reversed. But there is still a real meaning to be known, to be deciphered.